Mason Reed stepped to the fence with the patience of a medic walking through triage, letting every heartbeat choose the pace his boots would trust. Whitaker Morris, the rancher whose wrinkles kept the ledger of storms, folded his arms and warned that the animal tolerated neither pity nor pride. The young handler, Caleb Ortiz, held the gate chain like a rosary, because faith felt easier to borrow from steel than from words that failed yesterday. Mason watched the draft horse breathe, counting the rise and fall the way veterans count exits, then exhaled slowly so the air could meet the air without argument. Sunlight pooled on the chestnut coat like warm copper, and he noticed how muscle flinched where old welts slept, tiny biographies written in raised commas of pain. He did not reach a hand, he reached time, offering long seconds unbroken by chatter, because silence can become a bridge when fear has burned all other roads. Wind pushed a tumble of dust between them, and he let it pass without stepping back, telling the earth he would not hurry its small negotiations. Whitaker muttered that buyers hated questions in a horse, and this one was all questions, a thunderhead of doubt with hooves wide enough to crush certainty. Mason nodded without looking away, answering that doubt had kept him alive, and maybe it could keep this creature living long enough to learn safer weather. Caleb shifted his weight and asked if the man needed a prod, but Mason said tools were for fences and engines, while Trust preferred slower instruments. Somewhere beyond the corrals, a crow heckled the morning, and the horse flicked an ear toward the ridicule, then returned its gaze to the quiet stranger. He spoke the first words like water on hot iron, low and unbroken, telling the giant that nobody here knew its story, but he could carry one end if allowed. The horse blinked with the gravity of a judge and rolled one eye toward the chains, as if asking whether names for prisons counted as mercy or treachery. Mason answered by stepping half a pace sideways, giving an angle instead of a face, because predators offer fronts while companions offer space to breathe. Whitaker scraped boot leather on cedar rail and asked about the limp, and Mason replied that some roads teach you to move like rain around fragile roofs. The horse smelled sweat, sun, and something else on him, a salt that belonged to barracks and hospital tents, and the giant recognized fatigue without fear. He described no battles, yet his body kept them honest, and the animal read the report with nostrils wide, finding truth where language usually lies. Mason told them to loosen the highest chain one notch, not to promise freedom, only to promise breath, because breath is the first treaty living things sign. Caleb swallowed, glanced at Whitaker for permission, then worked the clasp with thumbs that wanted to be brave, praying the bolt would not narrate panic. Iron sighed, links settled, dust drifted, and the ground remembered that hooves have rhythms older than the fences men draw to quiet their worries. The horse shifted weight without surging, the kind of half-step earthquakes practice before choosing mercy, and Mason thanked it for the lesson in restraint. He told Whitaker that wounds make maps, and maps make detours, and detours take longer but crash less, which is cheaper for bones and cheaper for hearts. The rancher chewed the thought like old tobacco, then spat skepticism into the dirt, because time costs money, and money bleeds fast when feed barrels empty. Mason asked for rope, not to bind but to speak, a soft line to draw slow circles that say, stay, turn, breathe, and remember your body belongs to you. Caleb brought a coil that still smelled of last spring's foals, and Mason held it low like a question, never higher than a promise a frightened mind could accept. He made an oval in the dust and waited for one hoof to volunteer curiosity, not obedience, because curiosity builds doors that fear eventually dares to open. The giant considered the figure like a riddle about safer mornings, and after a long minute set a feathered foot inside, testing whether lines could hold kindness. Mason praised the choice softly, not with sugar, not with theatrics, only with the gratitude of someone who knows progress when it hides inside small movements. Whitaker looked away, pretending he had dust in his eye, and Caleb grinned despite himself, because victories that do not shout still taste like clean water. The veteran did not pet the horse. He matched its breathing again, and the paddock scaled the volume of the world down to a room where two beings could listen. Mason asked permission with posture rather than words, turning his body to half-width and stepping through the gate as if entering a chapel where breath itself was liturgy and every motion required reverence. The horse rose a fraction taller, muscles knitting like braided cable beneath the hide, yet held its ground because the stranger carried weather that did not demand thunder to prove it was real. He let the rope kiss the dust and shaped another oval slightly wider, inviting a slower orbit, a geometry that teaches prey instincts they may reconfigure danger without erasing caution. Caleb counted under his breath and stopped at 7, surprised to find the giant following the line with ears forward. Not dragged, not driven, simply escorted by patience toward calmer longitude. Mason praised the cadence with silence again, then added a barely audible murmur, the kind soldiers use when they count living friends at dawn and refuse to disturb whatever gods are listening. Whitaker asked what goal justified this museum pace, and Mason answered that nervous systems learn in teaspoons, not buckets. Otherwise they drown and call the waterproof of their fear. The giant tested one sidestep against the loosened chain, felt no sting, and tried another, a calculation that replaced explosions with mathematics. Ordinary hearts can survive. Flies stitched crooked patterns around their heads, and Mason simply blinked, accepting annoyance as tuition, because even irritation becomes instruction when force is off the table. He angled the rope to suggest a halt, then melted the suggestion the instant weight shifted correctly, paying the horse with disappearance, the currency prey brains trust most. Caleb whispered that this looked like sorcery, and Mason said it was only listening with elbows and ankles, a grammar that bodies read decades before mouths invent complicated verbs. He brushed the back of his knuckles against the halter cheekpiece, not touching skin, testing whether leather already meant punishment, and the absence of flinch felt like rain in July. Another notch came free with Whitaker's sigh, carefully measured, and the fence groaned like an old piano relearning a major chord it had avoided since somebody slammed the lid. The giant lowered its head by a single breath, a royal concession, and the veteran bowed a matching fraction, equal parts gratitude and tactical relief, disguised as etiquette. Mason traced the scar constellations with his eyes only, mapping how history had written the body in punctuation marks of survival that needed translation rather than erasure. He slid 1 foot backward to invite a yield of the shoulder, and the horse answered with a drift resembling forgiveness, not enthusiastic yet undeniably real to those who notice. Whitaker removed his hat and fanned the heat, conceding that feed money might stretch if catastrophe stopped visiting every afternoon, a financial prayer wrapped in rancher grumble. Mason told a small truth about names, that they are bridges, not leashes, and bridges collapse when built over panic, so the christening must wait until feet remember trustworthy ground. The chestnut ear twitched at the word, like a weather vane catching a shy wind, and a memory nobody here knew lifted within the ribs, where old roads still rattled. He shortened the circle to a square, and then to stillness, proving that rest is a place one can return to, not a trap that springs whenever the world blinks. Caleb took a step he had not meant to take, surprised by the ordinary miracle of nothing exploding, and laughed the nervous laugh people laugh when the future shrugs and sits down. Mason let the rope fall again, and counted 3 long breaths, teaching the paddock a new law. Movement earns rest, rest earns trust, and trust buys time cheaper than any insurance. He turned his shoulder toward the gate and walked away 2 paces, inviting the horse to choose whether company mattered, and the soft thud of following hooves answered without vocabulary. The veteran's eyes flicked bright, then quieted, because celebration can scare progress back into its burrow, and humility keeps baby steps from being hunted by old ghosts. Whitaker muttered that perhaps bullets had been premature math, and the admission tasted like rust and relief. 2 flavors ranches seldom serve in the same morning bowl. Mason coiled the rope and rested it over his forearm like a sleeping river, promising that today would end before thresholds snapped, because ending early is cheaper than repairing panic. He asked Caleb to bring water, not as reward but as ritual, so the body could file today under ceremony rather than ambush, a bureaucratic victory inside the nervous system. The giant drank with ears still alert, yet the swallow rhythm evened, and a droplet silvered the muzzle like a medal, the only decoration this particular veteran cared to award. Mason said tomorrow they would repeat the same music with fewer notes, because bright progress tempts greed. And greed is the thief that steals safety while pretending to be efficiency. The sun leaned west and threw long rails of shadow between them, and within those shadows, The first draft of a partnership penciled its outline across dust that remembered every footfall. As he latched the gate from inside the paddock, he looked at the horse and offered a promise without a name, that he would leave the chains quieter than he found them today. Dawn returned like a careful nurse, and Mason arrived early with coffee that tasted of burned determination, letting the quiet stitch itself back into a paddock that remembered yesterday's gentler ending. Whitaker checked the hinges and feed barrels with ritual precision, pretending he was only auditing costs, though his eyes kept orbiting the giant as if numbers had suddenly learned to breathe. Caleb swept the alleyway twice, a surplus of tidiness that belonged less to dust control and more to nervous energy, because hope always makes hands fidget when it first wakes up. The draft horse stood watching the horizon with cathedral stillness, a bronze monument warmed by sunrise, and its ears made tiny maps of wind directions like cartographers sketching safer futures. Mason set the rope in the dirt again, slower than yesterday, because repetition is the mother of safety and the aunt of memory, two relatives worth inviting every single morning. He exhaled in long ladders that the horse could climb, then waited for a hoof to volunteer motion, honoring curiosity as currency and paying on time with silence instead of sugar. When the first step came, he paid again by stepping away, demonstrating that approach can be reversed without punishment, and the nervous system filed that proof into a drawer labeled useful. Whitaker asked whether this deliberate pace might expire before buyers returned, and Mason replied that rushing is a tax collected by panic, and panic never refunds what it seizes. Caleb reported that the farrier could come Thursday if hooves allowed inspection, and Mason said Thursday was a country of tomorrows that we could reach by walking rather than sprinting. A freight train moaned somewhere beyond the highway, and the giant flinched toward the sound, then anchored again, testing whether yesterday's trust could hold against iron ghosts wearing distance. Mason softened his shoulders and let the rope become a suggestion rather than a command, an invitation that said you may, not you must, because choice writes deeper lessons than force. He touched leather again with the back of his knuckles, then withdrew before the flinch occurred, teaching that contact could end kindly, which is a grammar fear rarely expects. The horse sniffed his sleeve and found the library of old desert hidden in the fabric, pages of sweat and grit and morphine tents, and decided the book could stay open nearby. Whitaker told a story about a bridge washed out in spring, how the detour saved more cattle than the shortcut ever did, and Mason smiled because metaphors were doing part of his job. Caleb practiced breathing in the same tempo, trying to catch the music Mason kept humming under his ribs, and the paddock began to feel like a slow metronome instead of a courtroom. They shifted the highest chain one more hole to kindness, and iron responded with a quieter chatter, as if metal itself were conceding that loudness had never been a reliable strategy. Mason asked the wind to cooperate, and was surprised when it did, laying dust down like a blanket so eye contact could travel unbroken, a small mercy gifted by indifferent skies. A neighbor's dog barked and then apologized with silence, and the horse listened, measured and chose neutrality, proving that yesterday's rehearsal had survived the night without being looted by dreams. He shaped a wider circle and then narrowed it again, letting the body discover that geometry can predict safety, and prediction is a drug the brain will trade fear to purchase. Whitaker, against his habit, praised Caleb for patience, and the compliment fluttered through the rails like a bright moth, landing briefly on the horse's ear before continuing toward Mason's grin. Mason spoke of thresholds the way carpenters speak of door frames, insisting that you never slam a soul through one, because splinters lodge in memories and return as futures nobody desires. The giant blinked slow, lowered the head a sliver, and breathed into the space between them, a treaty written in warm fog that evaporated and yet somehow remained legible. He let a fingertip rest on the halter buckle for one heartbeat, then removed it, and the absence of panic felt like rain after months of weathermen, promising only the word maybe. Caleb edged closer with water again, and the horse drank without retreat, accepting the cup like a quiet medal ceremony, while Whitaker pretended to check fence posts to hide his smile. Mason asked the rancher about schedules, buyers, and reputations, gathering the politics around this animal like a map, because sometimes the trail is crowded with opinions disguised as landmarks. Whitaker admitted the county auction would pass through on Saturday, a caravan of checkbooks and gossip, and he feared the spectacle might turn the stallion into a campfire story again. Mason said the crowd could learn a different chapter if they met a calmer page, but only if today remained modest, because heroics at noon often collapse into ambulances by dusk. The horse sneezed dust glitter and shook the mane like thunder finding manners, and a ribbon of chestnut hair floated past Mason's cheek, as if signing a draft of truce. He ended the session early on purpose, sealing success inside a small box, since gifts kept tiny are easier for memory to protect from the thieves that prowl after sunset. Before leaving the paddock, he spoke a line that was not yet a name, promising to return tomorrow with the same patience and a cleaner mirror for courage to recognize itself. Whitaker suggested a quick proof for the neighbors, maybe a short lead line walk past the hayshed, and Mason declined gently, explaining that shortcuts often hide cliffs disguised as convenient scenery for impatient eyes. Caleb asked what injury could twist a mind so tight without breaking bone, and Mason answered that some accidents happen in the soul, where X-rays fail and only patience can illuminate the fractures worth setting. The giant exhaled through velvet lips and placed weight into the earth like a pilgrim entering sanctuary, then adjusted a hoof with careful dignity, a small bow that made the rails look kinder. Mason lifted the rope an inch and let it fall again like a breeze returning to itself, teaching that signals arrive softly and vanish faster when the answer is correct and courage is expensive. He spoke about charge and retreat the way tides counsel shorelines, advancing half a thought and withdrawing it whole, until the body learns that safety sometimes arrives wearing the clothes of hesitation. Whitaker's skepticism softened into arithmetic he could tolerate, because fewer explosions meant fewer boards to replace, and a ranch that replaces fewer boards sleeps deeper without dreaming of invoices. Mason asked permission from the halter metal and touched the withers with air rather than skin, then stepped away before memory could object, and the silence that followed did not taste of fear. The young handler watched the choreography and whispered that it looked like dancing with ghosts, and Mason smiled, admitting that ghosts prefer partners who don't insist on leading every step. The horse shifted toward him by the width of a breath, an almost invisible vote, and the veteran accepted the ballot without celebration, because victory that shouts will often wake old enemies. He unlooped the lowest chain for 4 heartbeats, counted each one like a medic measuring returning pulse, and refastened it before panic could nominate itself captain of the afternoon. No surge arrived, only a thoughtfulness that made the air feel heavier and friendlier, as if the paddock had decided to keep the weather at a volume appropriate for listening. Mason told Whitaker they would end before nerves grew greedy, and the rancher agreed with a grunt that hid a compliment, the way tough men wrap gratitude in canvas to keep it from tearing. Caleb laughed at nothing in particular, which is how relief leaves the body when it forgets to ask permission, and the horse twitched an ear like a conductor allowing applause between movements. They stepped outside the rails and watched the giant stand quietly with chains whispering instead of shouting, a museum that had decided to let visitors close without reaching for alarms. Mason unfolded a metal tag from his pocket, rubbed the edges smooth against his thumb, and remembered a friend who once taught him that names arrive only when the world feels safe to answer. He did not show the tag to anyone, only tucked it back where it had lived for years, a small coin of memory he would spend later, when the purchase could honor both ends of the story. Whitaker mentioned the auction again and asked whether a demonstration might prevent the crowd from inventing fear, and Mason said that the best demonstrations are quiet enough to be missed by gossip. The veteran drew a plan like a slow recipe: repeat, reduce, rest, reward with absence, and record any panic as information, not failure, because information ages into wisdom when handled kindly. Caleb nodded as if memorizing a hymn, and the paddock answered with stillness so complete that even flies negotiated their routes with courtesy, steering around eyelids like respectful pedestrians. The horse licked and chewed, not aggressively but thoughtfully, the way bodies file paperwork after court adjourns, and Mason honored the paperwork by leaving the desk before the clerk grew tired. He asked to open the gate fully for 1 minute without moving anyone, a rehearsal of freedom that ends before temptation gets dressed, and Whitaker timed it with a pocket watch older than both men. 60 seconds passed like a long Sunday, and nothing legal or illegal tried to escape, proving that sometimes the idea of open space scares less than the rumor of it sung by frightened memories. Mason closed the gate again and spoke a single syllable that was not a command, just a shape of sound, and the horse flicked an ear toward it as if testing the fabric for future clothing. He warned them that hungry audiences would arrive with cameras and confidence, and that their certainty might spook progress, so barriers for people would be as necessary as gentleness for the animal. Whitaker promised to keep the curious at the far fence, and to let Mason call the weather inside the rails, a transfer of authority that felt like handing over the ranch's pulse. The veteran allowed his hand to rest against Cedar for a long breath, grounding himself to timber and dust because healers bleed less when they remember they are not made of miracles alone. He walked away first and waited, and the soft decision of following hooves rearranged the air behind him, a quiet parade that wrote a sentence across the ground. Maybe is becoming yes. Caleb filmed nothing, took no photographs, and only whispered that he would rather remember this with his body, because sometimes proof makes beautiful things brittle before they learn to stand. They ended the session with water again, and the giant drank like a river, agreeing to meet the sea, not rushing, not resisting, just accepting that vastness can be gentle when invited properly. At the gate, Mason repeated the nameless promise and felt a word forming like dawn behind mountains, deciding to wait one more day before speaking it aloud where both histories could hear. The third morning unrolled like a bandage taken slow, and Mason stood outside the rails long enough to let the quiet decide whether it wished to continue yesterday's truce without revisions or witnesses. Whitaker carried a bucket he did not intend to use and set it down like punctuation, a period that could become a comma if the animal wrote a gentler sentence across the dust between heartbeats. Caleb arrived with a notebook he called a feed log, yet filled with small drawings of hooves and arrows, because sometimes language wants pictures when progress is too shy to speak loudly. The draft horse watched them with museum stillness again, but the stillness felt warmer, as if the glass between exhibits had thinned and visitors could hear the painting breathe in real time. Mason coiled the rope in wider ovals today, whispering the choreography of approach and retreat, then letting the floor memorize the steps so nerves could borrow the map when storms returned. He tested a touch with the back of his wrist at the shoulder blade and retreated before the memory argued, paying for the permission with absence, which costs more effort than candy ever will. Whitaker asked whether the animal's past would always run alongside them like a shadow, and Mason said, "Shadows are proof of light, not evidence that noon must apologize for yesterday." Caleb practiced the same breath count and found his lungs finally willing to keep tempo, discovering that control tastes less like power and more like patience salted with small forgivenesses. A truck backfired outside the property, and the giant flinched yet did not explode, choosing to fold the surge into stillness, like thunder deciding to finish its sentence in cursive. Mason praised the decision with silence again, then offered water without stepping forward, allowing the cup to exist as an idea before it became an action worth risking a memory upon. The horse took 2 sips and paused to listen, a diplomat reading the room. And the next 2 sips sounded like a treaty signing where pens are made of rain instead of sharpened metal. He lifted the rope and formed a shallow curve rather than a circle, inviting a drift that suggested partnership instead of compliance, because choice writes roots deeper than commands ever manage. Whitaker removed one glove and rubbed the rail as if polishing a chapel pew, a superstition he denied, while the animal lowered its head just enough to measure kindness without surrendering dignity. Mason stepped to the withers and stood parallel, matching the horse's horizon, then slid a foot back to ask for a yield, rewarding the smallest thought with the immediate vanishing of pressure. Caleb whispered that names felt closer than yesterday, and Mason nodded without answering, knowing that christening too early can trap a soul inside a word it has not yet agreed to carry. The wind brought the clink of distant tools from the farrier's yard, and the horse flicked both ears, sorting sounds like coins, keeping the silver of calm and discarding the copper of alarm. Mason let the halter speak first, lifting a single strap and lowering it twice, teaching contact to be a question rather than a verdict, then stepping away before memory could write objections. He breathed the desert rhythm he learned overseas, a count that honors the body's right to decline, and the paddock folded into that rhythm until even sunlight seemed to blink more slowly. Whitaker said the county men would want proof by Saturday, And Mason answered that proof would arrive disguised as boredom, because real safety looks dull to crowds hungry for fireworks. The giant shifted weight toward him by a letter's width, and he replied by softening his knees, proving that listening can be performed with bones, not only with ears borrowed from hope. Caleb unlatched the highest chain entirely and set it over the top board like a sleeping snake, and nothing bad happened, which is exactly how good stories prefer to announce their arrival. Mason slid the rope over the horse's neck without tightening, the way a friend rests a scarf across another's shoulders, and stepped away again so the gift could be tested without debt. The animal turned a fraction and kept him in the same slice of vision, an almost smile in equine geometry, and the air between them acquired the flavor of something nearly remembered. He asked for a step, and then cancelled the request the instant the hoof tried, teaching that compliance would never trap the body, because exits remain holy architecture in this church. Whitaker exhaled the way men do when barns survive a storm they cannot afford to repair twice, and the dust accepted the relief, laying down like a tired dog beside honest boots. Mason touched the cheek-piece leather properly now, counted a heartbeat, and withdrew with a thank you shaped like breath. A coin small enough to carry yet valuable enough to change futures. Caleb opened the gate a hand-width and stood still, not inviting escape, only letting the idea of further space visit, because sometimes imagination needs rehearsal before legs can believe it. The horse did not push or prance, it simply noticed, logged the option, and returned its attention to the strange man who refused to turn fear into theater for impatient spectators. Mason murmured that no rope would tighten today, that progress must leave the nervous system some sugar for later, or else tomorrow arrives broke and angry, demanding interest from bones. He ended the sequence with 3 long breaths, then set the rope down like a lullaby across the dust, and the paddock felt briefly like a living room where history finally sat to rest. Whitaker checked the sky the way farmers read accounts receivable, searching for storms in the margins, and found only a sheet of blue that gave permission for patience to keep drawing its quiet figures. Mason stood parallel again and invited a single step that he immediately cancelled with relief, proving that the road home remains open even when curiosity has already taken its first brave breath. The draft horse shifted like a tide choosing mercy, lowering the head until the chain barely murmured, and the paddock seemed to inhale a hymn that none of them had rehearsed aloud before today. Caleb noticed how fear now traveled shorter distances inside the animal, no longer sprinting from shoulder to hip, but walking like a tired traveler looking for a bench near a friendly window. Mason lifted the rope just high enough to sketch a door made of air, then stepped aside to show that doors can remain doors even when someone remembers the power to walk away freely. A fly landed on his cheek, and he let it stay a moment, because stillness was the lesson of the hour, and every swat would rewrite the paragraph they had spent days composing with patience. Whitaker leaned on Cedar, the way men lean on memories that ache yet hold, and he whispered that Saturday did not feel so dangerous anymore, as if the calendar had finally learned to be polite. The horse licked and chewed again with that bureaucratic dignity bodies use after anxiety committees adjourn, and Mason honored the paperwork by closing the office early before anyone grew restless. He traced the shape of a future beside the withers, not with fingers but with breath that smelled faintly of black coffee and desert mornings, and the animal answered with a slow blink of agreement. Caleb asked what name he was carrying in his pocket like a coin, and Mason said the word would arrive when the silence could wear it without tearing, which is rarer than applause can understand. A semi roared on the highway, and the paddock remembered its old fright, yet the surge collapsed into stillness before panic could nominate itself foreman, and pride walked the rails like a sentry. Mason offered the halter a second time and then withdrew again, teaching that conversations end gently here because endings that slam become ghosts that rattle doorknobs at 3 in the morning. The horse stepped toward him by the width of a brave idea, then stopped, and he matched the stop with gratitude so quiet it felt like shade, proving that companionship can be measured in echoes. Whitaker removed the lowest chain for 8 heartbeats and refastened it softly, and nothing argued except the memory of yesterday which grumbled, then shrugged, then wandered off to find a chair. Mason asked Caleb to walk 2 paces behind and breathe like a friend rather than a witness, inviting the paddock to become a living room where company matters more than performance ever will. The giant turned one ear toward the young handler and one ear toward the veteran, triangulating a map whose center tasted like safety, and the dust settled as if signing a modest contract. He set the rope over the neck once more without weight, a scarf returning for a visit, then took it away before the debt collector of history noticed and asked unpleasant questions about collateral. Whitaker laughed once, quick and embarrassed by its brightness, because joy on a ranch feels extravagant, and yet extravagance sometimes arrives under cover when the feed bills stop threatening sleep. Mason asked for the smallest yield of the hindquarters and received a whisper of movement that looked like forgiveness, and he rewarded it by erasing himself from the request faster than applause fades. Caleb murmured that the horse was beginning to look back rather than outward, and Mason nodded, explaining that partnership starts when eyes decide the present is safer than all remembered exits. A cloud crossed the sun, and the temperature softened, and in that gentler light the scars looked less like warnings and more like footnotes, which meant the main story could finally speak. He touched leather properly again, counted a full breath without argument from muscle or memory, and stepped away as if returning a borrowed book, grateful that no pages were torn by the reading. Whitaker asked whether tomorrow could include a short walk inside the paddock, and Mason said tomorrow was a bridge we were already halfway across, provided nobody sprinted to celebrate the midpoint. The horse exhaled a warm fog that smelled of alfalfa and old fear learning new verbs, and the veteran let his shoulders answer, lowering like curtains closing on a scene that ends in peace. Caleb tucked the coil against his ribs and discovered it felt light, which is how tools behave when they no longer double as arguments, and he smiled at the silent arithmetic of relief. Mason looked at the gate and decided the audition would not be today, because some miracles spoil if served hot, and patience plates them better when the audience is only dust and cedar rails. The animal shifted closer by a courage no wider than a pencil line, and he allowed the nearness to speak for them both, accepting that eloquence sometimes lives in distances that finally shrink. Whitaker promised to cancel 2 afternoon errands, saying he would rather guard this quiet than chase town receipts, and the confession landed like rain on roofs that remember drought too clearly. They ended with water again, letting the last swallow become the day's period, not an exclamation point because punctuation shapes memory, and memory shapes whether tomorrow arrives calm or shouting. As they closed the paddock and walked away, Mason carried the nameless promise like a lantern behind his ribs, certain that when the word finally arrived, it would belong to both of their histories. The 4th morning arrived smelling of alfalfa and wet cedar, and Mason paused at the gate long enough to let gratitude iron the creases out of his breath before the work began. Whitaker counted fence boards again, the ritual of a man who trusts wood more than luck, and found them intact, which felt like profit measured in silence rather than in coins. Caleb rolled the rope between nervous palms, then stilled his hands when the giant lifted its head, because bodies hear intentions sooner than words and judge them more honestly. The draft horse watched with a patient suspicion that had softened into curiosity, a delicate fabric that tears easily if pride pulls on it harder than trust can stitch. Mason entered sideways with shoulders lowered, offering the day like a cup of cool water, and the paddock accepted his presence the way chapels accept pilgrims who walk without speeches. He shaped a quiet S in the dust, not circle and not square, inviting a new question because learning grows deeper roots when the soil changes texture without threatening the seed. The horse stepped into the first curve and hesitated at the second, measuring the distance between yesterday's courage and today's doubts, then chose to proceed at the speed of kindness. Whitaker unclipped the highest chain entirely and draped it over the rail as gently as bedtime, and the metal behaved like a tired argument, finally learning the pleasure of surrender. Caleb stood at the far corner reading the room like a bodyguard, who has learned that peace is better served by soft posture than by visible bravado that electrifies old alarms. Mason lifted the rope to the neckline again and let it rest there like a shawl, then stepped away at once, paying the toll of trust with disappearance instead of commands. The giant breathed warm fog over his sleeve, found only the library of road dust and campfire coffee, and decided the book could remain open without the guard dog of panic on duty. He touched the halter leather with 2 fingers and withdrew before skin spoke, teaching that requests end kindly here, which is how memories agree to change their vote over time. Whitaker asked about the auction in 2 days and whether proof might be necessary. And Mason answered that boredom would be their proof, not spectacle, because safety seldom sells tickets. A hawk wrote a copper sentence across the sky, and the horse followed it with one ear. A geometry of attention that made the paddock feel like a classroom finally free of bullies. Mason asked for a step of the shoulder and cancelled the request the instant a muscle dreamed of yielding, teaching the body that movement does not imprison the future behind closing doors. Caleb exhaled on the same 4 count, and the dust obeyed by laying down, making a soft floor where hooves could draft calmer paragraphs without fear of punctuation made of jolts. The veteran lifted the loose rope and shaped a gate of air toward the center, then moved aside so Choice could walk through first, because choice travels farther when it leads. The horse entered the invisible doorway and paused like a diplomat testing the carpet, then dropped the head a whisper and let calm draft a small treaty upon the ground between hearts. Whitaker rubbed his jaw as if erasing bad arithmetic with callus, and he did not say he was impressed, but his silence wore approval like a hat that fit better than yesterday's doubts. Mason brushed the cheekpiece with the back of his fingers and let them fall, counting one breath, and the absence of flinch sounded like rain rehearsing forgiveness on a tin roof. He asked Caleb to walk a lazy arc behind, a half-moon of friendship that never closed, and the paddock learned that company could orbit without gravity raising its voice to command. A truck door slammed somewhere down the county road, and the giant startled, then folded the surge back into stillness like thunder deciding to end the sentence with a courteous semicolon. Mason praised the decision with quiet posture and lowered eyelids, proof that gratitude can be spoken fluently by bones when mouths risk turning gentleness into brass band announcements. He shortened the space between them by a patience's width and then lengthened it again, a tide that taught the shoreline to trust return without building new barricades every hour. Whitaker moved closer by one board and did nothing, which became a lesson all its own, because sometimes restraint is the most expensive tool on the ranch and the least used. Mason let the rope slip forward until it imagined the weight of a lead, then removed it before memory could protest, buying tomorrow's cooperation with the currency of today's relief. The horse breathed against his collar and discovered no electricity waiting in the cloth, just the dull nobility of sweat and time, and decided the day could proceed without alarms. Caleb whispered that hooves might allow a few steps later, and Mason agreed in theory while declining in practice, because milestones last longer when they arrive underdressed and unannounced. The veteran lifted his palm to the muzzle and left it hovering in the small weather before contact, then withdrew again, proving that almost touch can rewrite chapters without ink. He ended the sequence with 3 shared breaths and a half bow that matched the lowered head, closing the practice like a slow hymn, and saving the louder notes for a safer tomorrow. Whitaker adjusted his hat and let the silence keep score, understanding that every minute without commotion added interest to the fragile savings account they were building inside the animal's nervous system. Mason shaped a soft corridor with his body, a hallway made of breath and patience, then stepped aside before the horse felt trapped by kindness, because even love can bruise if offered like a wall. Caleb hovered at a respectful distance, learning that good help is sometimes the art of not correcting, the discipline of letting a better rhythm replace the hurried music in your own chest. The giant shifted forward the width of a careful thought, then paused to listen for old alarms, and only when none arrived did the ribs release a sigh that sounded like weather forgiving a roof. Mason traced a modest arc toward the center, a geography lesson drawn in dust, and invited a shoulder to unstick from yesterday, rewarding the tiniest tremor with disappearance rather than applause. Whitaker whispered that neighbors would not recognize this quiet, and Mason replied that recognition was unnecessary. Survival often chooses to be mistaken for boredom when gossip gathers. A distant hammer rang from the farrier's yard like a memory knocking, and the horse tilted an ear, measured the echo, and decided the sound could pass through without collecting a toll. Mason let the rope rest across the neck again, lighter than thought, and when muscle softened, he slid it away, banking a coin of trust where interest grows only under the shade of restraint. Caleb asked whether today might include a single step beside the rail, and Mason said yes in theory, and not yet in practice, because promises are strongest when they arrive already fulfilled. The veteran placed his palm near the muzzle, leaving a respectful inch of weather in between. And when the horse breathed into that small climate, the air smelled like courage learning to read. Whitaker unclipped the lowest chain for a brief ceremony of quiet, then refastened it gently, proving to the paddock that endings could be soft closures rather than doors slamming on memory's fingers. Mason lifted his chin toward the open space and turned his shoulder away, inviting the choice to follow without summoning it, and the soft thud of one forehoof wrote maybe in elegant cursive. Caleb smiled into his sleeve to keep the moment small, because shouting at miracles often scares them back into the dark. And this miracle preferred tea lights to fireworks and marching bands. The horse blinked slow, a lighthouse choosing longer rotations, and the world inside the rails matched the pace, trading sirens for lullabies, alarms for the arithmetic of steady breath. Mason brushed the cheekpiece with 2 fingers and gave it back to gravity, teaching that contact here ends early, like a conversation between friends who know tomorrow will continue the sentence. Whitaker walked a lazy rectangle outside the paddock, counting fences by touch instead of numbers, and discovered his hands no longer shook when he reached the boards that panic had cracked. The veteran shaped a quarter turn from the hindquarters and cancelled it mid-beginning, proving that permission can be revoked safely, which makes yes sweeter when the next chance arrives. Caleb practiced stepping in sync and felt the rope become lighter than language, a punctuation mark the body understood without grammar, like music you remember before learning the notes. The horse shifted close enough for coffee to share its warmth, and Mason thanked the nearness with smaller movements still, protecting the new bridge from the heavy boots of triumph. A wind ribbon lifted dust into brief halos around each ear, and the animal held steady, deciding that halos could visit without demanding worship, then let the dust fall back like friendly snow. Mason asked Whitaker to open the gate a palm's width and promised nothing more. And when the gap appeared, nobody moved, proving that open doors harm no one when curiosity learns patience. He closed the gap again and praised the stillness with retreat, reminding the paddock that rest is a place, not a trap, and places become home when departures remain gentle and available. Caleb fetched water, and the horse drank as if signing an attendance sheet, steady and unhurried, while the veteran stood quiet enough for gratitude to settle where speech might have broken it. Whitaker said the auction could watch from far away if it insisted, because today's lesson belonged to the 3 of them, and one large student who learned best without spectators grading breaths. Mason slipped the rope along the neck one last time and let it slide away like dusk leaving a window, a farewell so ordinary it felt holy, the kind of exit that promises a kinder return. The giant lowered its head the width of a syllable and flicked an ear toward him, and he bowed a fraction in reply. Not victory, but recognition, a handshake written in patient geometry. Caleb coiled the rope like a sleeping river and held it against his ribs, astonished that tools could weigh less when trust began carrying the heavier part of the afternoon's labor. Mason looked at the sky and decided the page should end here, before greed edited kindness into ambition, because ambition often forgets how fragile new sentences are in the mouths of survivors. They left the paddock slower than they entered, letting the gate close with the hush of a library, and somewhere under the horse's scars, a room unlocked another latch without anyone forcing the key. As they walked away, the veteran felt a name gather like rain behind mountains, not yet spoken, not yet earned, but close enough that even silence tasted faintly of copper and hope. Friday cracked open with a copper sunrise, and Mason walked the fence line as if proofreading yesterday's quiet, checking for commas of unease and scratching out any exclamation marks that panic had smuggled in. Whitaker greeted the day with a ledger under his arm and a prayer he would never admit to praying, the kind that measures profit in unbroken planks and in nights that finally remember how to sleep. Caleb arrived early with a rake he did not need, drawing patient patterns in dust like sheet music, because order in the ground sometimes teaches order in the breath that hovers just above it. The draft horse lifted its head when they entered, not with alarm, but with the slow attention of a cathedral opening doors, inviting pilgrims to step softly so history would not shatter underfoot. Mason paused outside the gate and let his ribs learn the tempo again, lowering his shoulders until even the hinges seemed to hum approval, a tiny choir rehearsing the hymn of not hurrying. He shaped a shallow corridor with his body, offering room like a gift with no ribbon, then looked away first because eyes can be heavy tools if they forget the difference between asking and demanding. The horse drifted one thoughtful step and listened for old thunder inside its bones, found only a distant drizzle of caution, and chose to keep the weather gentle by staying beside the quiet man. Whitaker slid the highest chain off the rail without ceremony, and the metal relaxed like a tired argument, while Caleb breathed a four-count that kept the paddock tuned to human-sized kindness. Mason rested the rope across the neck again like a friendly scarf, then removed it immediately, paying with disappearance so the nervous system could file today under voluntary rather than coerced. He lifted a hand toward the halter cheekpiece and stopped just shy of contact, letting the small weather between skin and leather say the first sentence, a language prey brains read fluently. A truck on the county road punctured the morning with a backfire, and the giant flinched, then folded the surge inward, choosing to write the rest of the sentence in cursive rather than capitals. Mason softened his knees and exhaled in ladders again, each rung a promise that exits remain holy here, and the horse answered with a breath that tasted less like alarm and more like remembering water. Caleb stepped into a half-moon behind them, practicing the geometry of support, learning that good help is the art of making safety visible without turning it into a noisy performance. Whitaker asked whether the crowd tomorrow would ruin this fragile grammar, and Mason said grammar survives gossip if the punctuation is kindness, because kindness ends sentences without slamming doors. The veteran touched leather for a full heartbeat and withdrew before old ghosts could vote, and the absence of protest felt like rain rehearsing forgiveness on a roof that once hated storms. He shaped a door made of air toward the center and walked through it first, then stepped aside so choice could follow unchased, a choreography that taught freedom how to keep breathing. The horse entered the invisible hallway and lowered its head a finger's width, a royal nod that made the rails look like balconies, and the dust settled as if signing a treaty written in fog. Mason whispered nothing useful to human ears and everything necessary to nerves, a sound shaped like persistence, and the animal listened with an ear that had learned to love unremarkable music. Caleb brought water and held it low, and the muzzle visited with dignity rather than urgency, filing the sip under ceremony, not reward, an administrative victory inside muscle memory. Whitaker paced the perimeter and did not interrupt, understanding that silence is sometimes the only translator strong enough to carry truth between species without dropping it. Then the midpoint arrived exactly where your picture lives. Mason's palm hovering near the bronze muzzle, sun rim-lighting the lashes, dust glittering like tiny constellations between two cautious galaxies. In that framed breath, the horse leaned forward by the width of a shy name, and Mason did not move to capture it. He only received the nearness, as if catching a falling candle without crushing the flame. A sudden tarp snapped behind the hayshed like a rifle teaching bad memories, and fear tried to write itself in capital letters, but the veteran's body answered with lowercase patience that would not escalate. He turned half away and let gravity speak, sinking weight through his heels until the ground borrowed his steadiness, and the giant borrowed the ground, a chain of calm without iron or threat. Caleb froze in the right kind of stillness, the kind that says I am here without saying look at me, and Whitaker gripped the rail softly, as if holding the edge of a lullaby that must not be dropped. The horse trembled, then exhaled a fog that smelled of alfalfa and almost summer rain, and the tremble drained through the legs into dust, leaving only a quiet that knew how to stand upright. Mason offered the door of air again and cancelled it mid-gesture, rewarding the flicker of trust with vanishing pressure, because disappearing at the right moment becomes the most persuasive teacher. The muzzle touched his sleeve by accident or courage, and he allowed the accident to be heroic without trapping it in celebration, protecting the new bridge from the heavy feet of triumph. A meadowlark stitched a bright thread across the fence line, and the song passed through the animal like a kind rumor, replacing a page of bad history with a margin note that simply read, maybe. He ended the set early, sealing the image inside memory while it was still warm, because miracles spoil when overcooked, and tomorrow would need this fresh flavor to season a longer journey. Whitaker suggested a photograph to bless the moment, and Mason declined gently, guarding the memory inside bodies so it would stay living and supple rather than brittle and framed by pixels that demand performance. He reset the paddock with a neutral stance and a softened spine, proving that endings arriving on time preserved tomorrow's appetite for risk without inviting adrenaline to rewrite the lesson in capital letters. Caleb asked about practicing a single walking step, and Mason proposed a breath-measured shuffle that begins and ends before excitement notices, a rehearsal small enough to slip past the guards of panic. The horse offered half a stride, checked the sky's volume for old thunder, then completed it with a modest certainty that felt sturdier than any applause impatient witnesses might try to manufacture. Mason yielded backward in acknowledgement, letting the floor behave like a quiet companion, and he slid the rope away, so choice remained the legal owner of every inch they had just traveled together. Whitaker warned that buyers would bring loud opinions, and Mason answered that quiet competence outlasts commentary when first impressions are built from serenity instead of spectacle that exhausts fragile nerves. They rehearsed a soft halt, a lighter release, and 3 counted breaths, placing small receipts into the trust ledger, and the math penciled favorable without faking certainty or hiding the cost of caution. A pickup rattled across the cattle guard and scattered noise. The horse tightened, then softened, proving that Thursday's lesson still held even under the extra freight of a crowded Friday morning. Mason brushed the cheekpiece for one patient beat, then withdrew like a tide leaving gifts, allowing confidence to settle where waves once vandalized the shoreline with their hurried, breaking voices. Caleb mirrored the pause 2 steps behind, learning to speak with kneecaps and shoulders, and the paddock answered by turning quiet into a language everyone could understand without translation from fear. The veteran invited a tiny pivot from the hindquarters, then cancelled it at the first whisper of try, paying with disappearance so the success could belong to the student rather than the teacher. Whitaker breathed a thank you into his hat brim, folding gratitude small so it could travel farther, and the horse flicked an ear as if overhearing manners being practiced with deliberate humility. Mason opened the gate a palm's width and named the moment rehearsal, not test, then closed it before temptation woke, proving that open doors merely offer rather than insist on immediate decisions. A slow cloud cooled the arena, and in the softened light, the scars looked like footnotes that no longer insisted on interrupting every paragraph, allowing the main story to finally speak. He coaxed one more micro-step and returned it instantly, reinforcing that the price of motion would never be captivity and promising that rest would always arrive before nerves ran out of provisions. Caleb offered water from the scene's quiet edge, and the horse drank in thoughtful sips, filing proof that ceremonies repeat reliably when trust keeps the calendar honest, humane, and mercifully simple. Mason planned human fences with Whitaker, parking lines, a buffer of calm, shaded rails, so tomorrow the animal's heart would not perform boundary duty alone, while curiosity pressed its face against progress. Whitaker agreed to hang cloth for shade and privacy, a small curtain telling gossip to whisper elsewhere, while honest work kept breathing inside this square of dust without needing applause to survive. The veteran warmed a metal tag in his palm and chose to wait again because names spoken too early bruise like boots crossing a newborn bridge that has not finished learning its own strength. Caleb asked if the word belonged to war or home, and Mason said true names belong to healing, the kind that stitches both places together without erasing either chapter from the book of truth. The horse stepped close enough to paint his sleeve with breath, and he thanked the nearness by lowering his eyes, remembering that reverence keeps courage from tripping over the noise of victory. A gust rattled the tarp and almost resurrected panic, but the memory collapsed before standing, leaving only a brief tremor that melted into dust like rain, deciding to become soil rather than flood. Mason touched leather for 2 heartbeats, then walked away first, inviting the horse to write the last sentence, and the soft decision of following printed an almost word across the dirt behind them. Whitaker muttered that better buyers might now see value rather than danger, and Mason replied that value grows visible when fear stops narrating, a miracle that never requires trumpets or confetti. Caleb coiled the rope slowly, not to restrain but to protect the quiet, and the tool felt light as ribbon because the heavy part of labor now lived in trust instead of tension and steel. The veteran asked for the gate to open halfway for 60 breaths with nobody moving, and the world obeyed, proving that shared air through open space can be safer than locks advertised as certainty. He closed the gate and promised that tomorrow they might take 3 true steps together, under shade and calm, with spectators kept distant enough for courage to hear its own voice clearly. The horse yawned a long, elastic yawn like stress evacuating, then shook from pole to tail, and every chain whispered smaller as if resigning from a job they never liked performing for anyone. They finished with water and a slow bow of heads, 3 humans and 1 giant student agreeing to rest, while the lesson stayed warm, because warmth carried overnight becomes tomorrow's reliable kindness. As they left, Mason felt the name gather like weather behind hills, and he decided that if dawn arrived as gentle as hope, the word would step forward to meet the muzzle without trembling or disguise. Evening laid copper along the rails while Friday exhaled its heat, and Mason walked the perimeter, checking shade cloth lines and people barriers as if proofreading courage before tomorrow's loud punctuation. Whitaker hauled 2 bales to build a gentle wall near the viewing area, explaining that hay calms both animals and rumors because busy mouths choose chewing over commentary when nerves begin to whisper. Caleb measured a buffer lane with stakes and soft rope, a hallway for spectators' curiosity to stay polite, drawing boundaries that kept human weather from gusting inside the fragile classroom of trust. The draft horse watched the choreography with cathedral attention, ears mapping the slow ballet, and the dust settled flatter as if the ground itself approved of the plan written in ordinary kindness. Mason rehearsed 3 breaths beside the muzzle, then stepped back 2 shoe lengths and returned 1, teaching the nervous system that math can be merciful when subtraction follows addition without penalty. He shaped a door of air toward the center and cancelled it twice on purpose, proving that opportunities can be invitations rather than traps, a lesson anxiety rarely believes without repetition. Whitaker asked if a brief halter lead might be attempted, and Mason nodded in theory while refusing in practice, reminding that tomorrow's proof will be stronger if tonight sleeps inside small victories. Caleb brought water and set it low, and the muzzle arrived like a dignitary rather than a refugee, taking unhurried sips that filed under ceremony, not reward, in the ledger of surviving memories. A tarp fluttered, then learned its manners under a light clamp, and the horse flinched, then folded stillness over the tremor, a choice that traced a quiet signature along the evening's margin. Mason touched the cheekpiece leather for a full breath and released early, paying with disappearance again, because endings that arrive gently teach futures to approach without dragging chains behind them. He asked Whitaker to practice crowd silence, and the rancher demonstrated by saying nothing brilliantly, an eloquence built from restraint that turned the paddock into a chapel without announcing worship. Caleb stepped 2 paces behind the veteran and matched the kneecap grammar, learning to speak helpfully with posture so the day could keep its heartbeat steady while history watched from a distance. The giant shifted closer by an inch of bravery and found no ambush waiting, only the dull nobility of sweat and patience, and the ribs released a small hymn that nobody tried to name aloud. Mason placed the rope across the neck again like a scarf that never tightens, counted 3 heartbeats, then let it slide away, saving tomorrow's appetite for cooperation from tonight's greedy celebration. The sun sank behind windmills and turned their blades into quiet metronomes, and each rotation seemed to measure the new distance between panic and calm, a gap now walkable without sprinting. Whitaker checked the gate latch twice and decided to believe in luck disguised as preparation, the only costume fortune wears when men are honest about what they can and cannot control. Caleb drew a small chalk line where hooves had paused confidently, calling it the place courage stopped to drink, a landmark for memories to find again when storms come begging for attention. Mason asked for a shoulder yield the width of a thought, then erased himself mid-gesture, honoring the first twitch of yes with vacancy, the rare reward that prey instincts trust more than sugar. A train sighed on the horizon and rattled old ghosts. The horse listened, compressed the surge and allowed quiet to bloom back through the withers, a bloom tough enough to ignore distant iron. The veteran folded a towel over the top rail to test moving cloth in calmer rhythm, and the ears flicked, then settled as if the world's edges had finally learned to stop shouting their outlines. He spoke about tomorrow's choreography in a voice meant for bones, 3 steps under shade, a pause for breath, a soft turn, and the gate closing like a library book no one hurries to return. Whitaker agreed to keep bidders beyond the buffer and to let silence price value because serenity sells better to decent hearts, while spectacle only feeds those who bargain with fear. Caleb asked if the name would help, and Mason said names bridge history when spoken at the right temperature, but burn when shouted early, so tonight the word must remain warm and hidden. Fireflies stitched green commas along the pasture edge, and the horse watched them without alarm, learning that flicker does not always predict danger. Sometimes it simply edits darkness into gentler paragraphs. Mason placed his palm near the muzzle and left a thumb of space, letting breath meet breath without collision, and when the horse exhaled, gratitude echoed quietly along the cedar rails. He stepped away first to protect the new bridge, because triumph stomps where reverence tiptoes, and this victory required soft shoes that would not wake the heavy sleepers of memory. Whitaker brought a curry comb and did not use it, laying the tool where eyes could see it without feeling invaded. A rehearsal that told equipment to behave like furniture rather than threats. Caleb practiced closing the gate slowly, counting 4 beats so hinges would hum kindness, and the hardware obeyed, proving that even metal can learn civility when hands refuse to rush. The veteran ended the work early again, insisting that tomorrow must arrive hungry for calm rather than full of adrenaline, a strategy that saved many lives in deserts that never apologized. Night rose like a velvet curtain, and as they left, the giant stood easy beneath quiet stars, while inside Mason's pocket the unspoken name warmed like a coin waiting for a rightful purchase. Night thickened into a quilt of quiet, and Mason walked the empty lane between the people ropes, rehearsing the rhythm of 3 calm steps, 1 soft turn, and a closing gate that sounded like courtesy rather than control. He pictured hands that might point or whisper tomorrow, then imagined those hands settling into pockets, because dignity grows best when spectators learn that silence is participation rather than punishment for curiosity. Whitaker locked the outer gate and tested the latch twice, not from fear of escape, but from respect for boundaries, understanding that good fences protect calm as faithfully as they guard livestock and ledgers. Caleb gathered the stray buckets and coiled the extra line with slow precision, letting neatness become a lullaby, because organized corners make it easier for fragile courage to find a place to sit. Crickets tuned the pasture, and the wind wrote long sentences across the shade cloth, and the giant listened with a patience that suggested tomorrow could arrive without demanding tribute from old panic. Mason set the rope on a rail where moonlight could wash it clean of yesterday's worries, reminding himself that tools carry memory, and memory needs gentleness if it is to stop shouting along the fibers. Whitaker admitted he had told no one about the quiet progress, choosing to preserve the story from the hunger of gossip, because some harvests sprout deeper when the field stays unadvertised. Caleb asked whether hope ever frightened him, and the veteran answered that hope is a skittish colt, useful and beautiful, but likely to bolt if cornered by schedules pretending to be certainty. They stood together and let their breathing match the slow lift and fall of the horse's ribs, discovering that shared air can braid human plans to animal trust without tying hard knots that later scar. A distant coyote stitched a thin thread of sound through the pasture, and no hooves struck timber. No chain protested, only the ordinary night continued, which is how safety prefers to introduce itself. Mason spoke softly to the stars the way soldiers speak to absent friends, promising to pay tomorrow in modest steps and early endings, because lives stay whole when ambition remembers to whisper. He placed the towel back in a bucket and smiled at the quiet absurdity of props, grateful that even cloth had learned manners, swaying like a friendly curtain rather than a door slamming on nerves. Whitaker offered coffee that tasted like forgiveness and wood smoke, and the veteran accepted, tasting a future where this paddock might trade invoices of fear for receipts of steadiness and sleep. Caleb traced with his boot the small oval where the muzzle had rested, and he did not photograph it, letting memory keep the tenderness warm instead of freezing it into pixels that demand applause. The horse shifted in the moonlight and lowered its head until starlight embroidered the mane, then breathed a fog that rose and vanished, a signature written in warmth across the ledger of night. Mason considered the word again and decided to keep it wrapped, because names weigh what they bless, and tomorrow's spine should not carry syllables heavier than the bridge they are meant to cross. He walked to the outer fence and checked the parking sightlines, imagining where impatience might gather, then sketched a human tide map that kept waves low so courage could hear its own heartbeat. Whitaker promised to greet bidders with the calm of a library and the rules of a picnic, asking them to bring manners instead of commentary, which is a rarer currency, yet worth the posted price. Caleb worried aloud about a single loud laugh or dropped thermos, and Mason said their job was not to erase noise from the world, but to teach the body a grammar that refuses to answer every shout. The veteran returned to the rail and practiced the slow bow he would give if the moment permitted, a gesture that thanked the present without trapping it in celebration, heavy enough to bruise progress. An owl crossed the paddock like a grey paragraph changing tone, and the animal watched, then relaxed, filing the wing beat under neutral weather, a category that grows larger when trust is fed properly. Mason set his palm near the muzzle once more and left an inch of night between, and breath met breath without collision, the smallest communion, holy mostly because neither side demanded anything louder. He stepped away first, teaching that departures can be gifts, and the soft decision of non-chase allowed courage to remain standing, a rare luxury for histories accustomed to sprinting toward alarm. Whitaker closed the barn door and let the hinge sing a quiet note, promising to oil the tune tomorrow, because even music should not scrape the air when fragile lessons are trying to sleep. Caleb rolled the final hose and discovered it felt light, not because rubber had thinned, but because dread had, a subtraction no ledger can show, and yet the only math that changes mornings. The three of them walked the perimeter one last time and let the night edit their worries into shorter sentences, choosing commas of caution over exclamation points that would wake unnecessary thunder. Mason paused at the main gate and looked back, seeing not a problem penned in wood, but a student awaiting class. And the realization loosened something old that had been clenched behind his ribs for years. Stars leaned closer, as if curious about kindness, and the pasture breathed like an enormous sleeping thing, while tomorrow arranged its chairs quietly, promising to arrive as early as decency allows. They left without ceremony, allowing the lesson to cool like bread on a windowsill, and every step toward the house sounded like punctuation that prefers periods of rest to question marks of doubt. In the dark kitchen, he set the metal tag beside his cup and finally formed the silent word with his mouth alone, deciding that if dawn came gentle, he would let the name meet the muzzle like light meeting water. Saturday dawn pulled a pale ribbon across the paddock, and Mason woke with the name warm on his tongue, then hid it again, choosing reverence over hurry so courage would not feel hunted by hope. Whitaker opened the outer gate and posted simple rules about silence, explaining with a nod that calm is the currency here, and that noise spends it faster than any ranch can afford to earn back. Caleb stretched fresh shade cloth and walked the buffer lane twice, setting water at the quiet corner, teaching the ground to host manners so the air could remember how to breathe without orders. Trucks rolled in on whispering tires, passengers carrying curiosity like bright coins, and Whitaker greeted each group with soft authority, inviting their patience to sit down before their eyes did. Mason met the draft horse at the gate and matched its breathing, letting heartbeats negotiate a truce, the kind signed without pens, where both histories agree to arrive as gently as daylight. He entered sideways with lowered shoulders and drew a corridor of air toward shade, then stepped aside, proving again that doors are safer when choice walks first and pride stays 2 steps behind. The rope rested across the neck like a scarf that owes no debt, and he removed it instantly, paying with disappearance so memory could file the moment under voluntary rather than coerced. He asked for a thought of forward and cancelled it the instant the ankle whispered yes, rewarding the almost with absence, the rare treat that prey instincts trust more than sugar or praise. Children leaned on rails with open mouths, and their parents learned stillness from the lines on Whitaker's face, the kind of lines that tell you silence is a tool, not just the lack of chatter. Wind touched the tarp with 2 shy fingers, and the horse tensed, then softened its ribs like a tide choosing manners, while Mason let gravity anchor his heels until the tremor remembered how to leave. A bidder chuckled something about wild stock, and Whitaker's glance erased the sentence mid-air, replacing it with a hush that respected lessons better than any sign could hope to enforce. Under shade, Mason breathed a ladder of counts and invited 3 steps that finished early on purpose, then offered stillness like a porch, the kind where rooms decide to open without being asked. He opened the gate a palm's width so ideas could visit, then closed it before temptation woke, proving that open doors can be teachers when they are not disguised as traps for skittish hearts. Caleb brought water low and steady, and the muzzle visited like a dignitary, taking thoughtful sips, while the crowd learned how boring safety looks when it is busy saving lives quietly. A phone rose at the far fence, and Whitaker lowered it with a gentle finger, reminding that some miracles spoil when caged in pixels, and that today prefers breath to applause. Mason touched leather for a full heartbeat and withdrew before muscles could vote, and scars faded into footnotes under that softer light, allowing the main story to speak without interruption. He felt the cool circle of a metal tag in his pocket and decided to keep the syllables wrapped, because names weigh what they bless, and bridges must be tested before they carry meaning. A freight train moaned beyond the highway, and the horse measured the echo, then returned to stillness without borrowing panic while Mason let his knees narrate gratitude instead of his mouth. He asked the shoulder for a microscopic yield and erased himself the instant it arrived, proving that success here travels best in unmarked wagons, safer from thieves named Pride and Hurry. He spoke low to bones rather than ears, promising early endings and gentle punctuation, and the air around them adopted the pace, trading sirens for the grammar of steady, competent breath. The auctioneer approached with a ledger and polite eyebrows, and Mason explained the boundaries again, that today's proof would look like boredom, which is how real safety prefers to dress. The giant stretched its neck and blew a soft fog onto his sleeve, and Mason bowed a fraction in reply. A ceremony so modest the crowd felt privileged merely to keep from breaking it. Caleb counted breaths like a quiet metronome and wrote down tiny victories, learning that the best help becomes nearly invisible when trust is trying to memorize a calmer alphabet. Whitaker's skepticism had turned into guardianship, and he held the rope line like a priest of silence, protecting the lesson from the appetite of spectacle disguised as honest interest. Mason set a towel to move lazily on the rail, and the ears flicked, then settled, teaching the body that flutter can be furniture, not lightning, if patience keeps paying the utility bill. A thermos slipped from a stranger's hand and clapped the dirt, and the horse startled a syllable, then chose stillness while 36 lungs remembered how to exhale without making speeches. Mason added no pressure, only waited with softened spine, and the soft thud of a following hoof arrived like kindness, declaring in quiet script that companionship had voted yes without coercion. He ended the sequence early again, sealing the warmth while it was still alive, because overcooked miracles turn brittle, and tomorrow will need tenderness more than it needs souvenirs. Around the rails, the word Ferocious began to look embarrassed, and the crowd's story reshaped itself, discovering that monsters sometimes dissolve when someone refuses to feed them fear. Mason pressed the tag to his palm and breathed 3 slow rungs, deciding the word might meet the muzzle before noon if the wind stayed courteous, and if humility remembered to keep time. Noon approached like a careful tide, and the buffer lane held the audience steady, while Mason measured the air the way medics measure pulse, testing whether the room could carry one more gentle truth. Whitaker gestured for distance with 2 quiet palms, turning chatter into nods, and even the auctioneer adjusted his ledger grip, sensing that numbers might need to whisper if wisdom hoped to speak today. Caleb set the rope across the neck for a single breath and removed it again, a ceremony repeated not for show but for memory, which prefers habits over speeches when danger used to own the microphone. The horse shifted a patient inch toward shade and tasted the morning with nostrils like small barometers, finding only mild weather in the veteran's shoulders and a promise folded neatly behind his ribs. A spectator coughed and then apologized to no one in particular, because the paddock had become a listening room where even errors learned manners, and the giant blinked as if forgiving the intrusion with grace. Mason softened his knees and drew a door of air that stopped halfway open, then vanished it like a magician who refuses applause, teaching the crowd that the best tricks are simply kindnesses performed consistently. He looked at Whitaker, then at Caleb, and found agreement resting in both faces, the kind of unspoken yes that strong teams use when caution and courage finally choose to hold hands without competing for credit. The veteran set his palm near the bronze muzzle, and left a thumb of peace between skins, allowing breath to braid breath. And in that small weather, the word he had carried woke up and asked permission to live. He pressed the coin-smooth tag against his heart and remembered the timber that kept this ranch standing, the scent that held days together, and he realized the right syllable had been leaning on every rail all along. He whispered the name softly enough for Bones to hear it first, a single word shaped like shelter and shade, Cedar, and the dust between them seemed to nod, as if the ground itself recognized an old friend returning. The horse flinched not at the sound, but at the absence of demand inside it. A novelty so rare that ears tilted forward like open hands, and the ribs released a sigh that tasted like water after a long march. Caleb repeated the name once under his breath, and then tucked it away, understanding instinctively that names grow stronger when handled like seedlings, not banners, and Whitaker let the syllables sit without taxing it. Mason did not reach to capture the moment. He stepped half a pace aside so the word could walk the last inch on its own legs, honoring that bridges cross better when no one jumps to test their strength too early. Cedar, he said again, with less sound and more intention, inviting history to unclench, and the muzzle drifted into his sleeve like a ship finding harbor, steady and slow, neither pushed nor pulled by any visible tide. A child at the far rail smiled into both hands to keep the happiness small, and an old rancher removed his hat in a gesture that looked like superstition, but felt more like gratitude, finally learning the correct posture. The auctioneer closed his ledger for a minute and allowed the crowd's price to recalculate, discovering that worth multiplies quietly when fear stops narrating, and that math can be merciful when taught by patient teachers. Mason offered 3 steps inside the shade and cancelled the third mid-beginning, rewarding Cedar with disappearance, and the horse answered with a tiny pivot that looked exactly like dignity remembering its own body. Whitaker muttered that the label Ferocious had become a bad joke and promised to rewrite the signage in his head, while Caleb's shoulders settled into a rhythm that made breathing sound almost like singing. The veteran asked for the gate to open a palm's width and promised nothing further, and Whitaker obliged, and Cedar did not rush, which taught every watcher that doors can bless without demanding swift devotion. A thermos lid clicked somewhere unhelpfully bright, and the horse startled a syllable, then chose stillness while Mason let gravity carry patience into his heels until the tremor emptied itself without borrowing alarm. He spoke to Bones again, thanking the present tense for arriving, then ended the sequence early because victories deserve shade and rest, and because tomorrow's courage should never pay interest on today's pride. The crowd released a long quiet like a congregation excused without benediction, and some eyes shone, not from spectacle but from the relief of witnessing gentleness do arithmetic better than violence ever could. Whitaker asked what came next, and Mason answered that next would be paperwork and hay and time, and perhaps a simple transaction where both sides paid mostly with sleep and a promise to continue whispering. Caleb, unable to stop smiling, asked whether the name meant wood or refuge, and Mason said it meant both, and also the scent of mornings that have survived storms without forgetting how to be kind to noon. The veteran touched the cheek piece for 2 heartbeats and stepped away first, letting Cedar write the last sentence, and the soft, voluntary follow translated across the paddock more clearly than any speech could manage. A neighbor lowered his bid before speaking it, because the ledger inside his chest had recalculated too, and he realized that some purchases are simply transfers of stewardship to whoever has already begun the work. Whitaker cleared his throat and said the ranch would honor that calculus, that if Mason wished, the price could be fair and the papers quick, provided the lesson remained as quiet as it had begun. Mason nodded once, eyes bright and steady, and said he would commit not only coin but hours, promising that names are bridges maintained by maintenance, not monuments satisfied with a single day's unveiling. Cedar breathed into his sleeve again, and the warm fog stitched their futures together with invisible thread, while the crowd learned that sometimes the miracle is not change, but the safety that finally allows it to appear. They closed the gate with library softness, and the veteran pressed the tag flat against his palm, grateful that the word had chosen to live, and more grateful still that it had arrived without breaking anything to prove itself. The crowd thinned into respectful silhouettes along the fence, and Whitaker closed the ledger without triumph, letting the afternoon cool the paddock so today's quiet could harden into tomorrow's dependable foundation. Mason thanked the onlookers with a nod that asked for continued silence, then turned his shoulders to match Cedar's breathing, allowing calm to draft again before any new sentence dared to enter the arena. Caleb rolled the buffer rope slowly, careful not to scrape the air because even the sound of twine against wood can tug on nerves that only just learned to trust their own unclenched posture. Cedar stood beneath the shade cloth and listened to the pasture's grammar, filing the day under chapters where doors open gently, where ending early tastes like victory rather than like unfinished business. Whitaker spoke about papers and costs in the soft register of men who value sleep, proposing terms that paid the ranch's feed while honoring the work that had turned thunder into a cooperative drizzle. Mason answered that stewardship would be a contract with hours more than dollars, promising that names require maintenance, the kind done with breath and patience rather than with signatures alone. The auctioneer accepted the new arithmetic and stepped back, discovering that some deals prefer to be witnessed only by dust and cedar rails, which record history without gossiping it into something louder. Caleb fetched a clean halter with brass that did not shine, a tool as humble as good manners, and set it on the rail where eyes could see it without feeling the word should welded to their ribs. Mason let his palm hover a thumb of weather from Cedar's muzzle and whispered the name once in a tone that sounded more like shade than command, inviting the syllable to mean rest before it ever meant go. Cedar exhaled an answer that smelled of hay and relieved muscles, then lowered the head a fraction as if gravity itself had softened, and the moment wrote its small signature across the dust. Whitaker suggested a farrier look not for heroics, but for planning, because hooves tell truth about journeys, and journeys that heal need maps drawn on the ground before anyone starts packing expectations. Mason agreed on the condition of quiet tools and slower hands, and a call went out to an old friend who trimmed more anxiety than horn, a craftsman fluent in the calm grammar they were teaching. While they waited, the veteran shaped a door of air and cancelled it twice, rewarding Cedar's thought of forward with vanishing pressure, feeding the nervous system with a currency rarer than sugar or applause. Caleb carried water low and steady, and Cedar drank in deliberate sips that sounded like a pen signing peace, the kind of treaty that outlives crowds because it was never written for them anyway. A truck crested the lane without drama and stopped behind the windbreak, and the farrier stepped down with boots that understood churches, setting his box like a hymnal rather than a trumpet. He greeted the animal with eyes at half brightness and knuckles offered sideways, then waited for breath to braid with breath, acknowledging that every good touch begins as a question seeking permission. Mason spoke the choreography for bones to hear. One look, one breath, one pause, then perhaps a fingertip against a shoulder blade, and the farrier nodded like a man who had already buried his hurry. Cedar watched the open box of tools and found no demands pushing from it, only steel that had learned to be furniture until invited, a novelty that made Flinch choose to stay folded and quiet. The farrier lifted a rasp and lowered it again without use, letting the shine mean nothing. And only then did he touch a fetlock with air, withdrawing instantly so the yes could arrive unchased. Whitaker swallowed his urge to narrate and became part of the silence, learning how to help by not helping, which is the rancher's hardest lesson and the horse's most expensive request. Mason asked Cedar for a single thought of weight shift, then returned the request to stillness before it completed, paying with disappearance so memory could label the moment as voluntary rather than conquered. The farrier crouched and breathed like a metronome, and when hoof lifted, it did so by consent rather than capture, a detail small to spectators but enormous to bodies that used to survive by guessing. He trimmed only a whisper from one edge, then set the foot down as though returning a borrowed book, making sure no page bent, no sentence tore, and no ghost found reason to rattle the shelves. Caleb released a smile into his sleeve to keep it from startling courage, and Cedar blinked as if filing the rasp under weather, a harmless breeze that did not insist on becoming storm. Mason touched the cheekpiece for a patient heartbeat and stepped away first, demonstrating again that yes is sweeter when exits remain unlocked, a theology learned in deserts where doors often lied. The farrier trimmed a second hoof with the same liturgy of breath and pause, then closed his box politely, declaring the lesson complete because progress prefers to stop while it is still hungry. Whitaker paid him in cash and gratitude, both counted carefully, and the man left without dust or commentary, leaving behind a paddock that felt like a classroom after a kind teacher dismisses early. Mason set the halter over Cedar's neck like a scarf, lifted the crown for 1 second, then let it fall, a rehearsal that taught leather to mean conversation rather than verdict or sentence. Cedar stepped the width of a respectful idea and paused, ears forward, ribs steady, and the veteran matched the pause with gratitude that traveled down his heels into the floor like useful roots. They ended the sequence before ambition woke from its nap, closing the gate with the library's hush again, and the afternoon arranged its chairs for rest while tomorrow's courage penciled a bigger map. The afternoon leaned into a long amber yawn, and Whitaker suggested Sunday become a full Sabbath for nerves, a day of quiet chores and pasture walking, so today's gains could knit properly beneath untroubled sleep. Mason agreed to pause the choreography, explaining that muscles learn best when victories cool slowly, the way bread finishes in its own heat after leaving the oven, fragrant and unforced by hungry hands. Caleb swept the lanes in wide, patient strokes, drawing one last lullaby across the dust, because tidy ground keeps courage from tripping over yesterday's clutter and calling the stumble a prophecy. Papers appeared like polite weather rather than thunder, and Whitaker priced the animal at fairness instead of drama, subtracting rumor and adding sleep, two line items that accountants rarely balance. Mason counted the bills with the same deliberate breath he used at the rail, then slid them forward, as if paying tithes to quiet itself, a currency that buys more than panels and feed. The auctioneer initialed discreet margins, then closed the ledger with a librarian's touch, acknowledging that some stories prefer to be shelved under compassion rather than circulated as spectacle. Caleb fetched a simple lead line that felt like a handshake rather than a leash, laying it where sunlight could bless it without demanding performance from memories that now chose dignity. Mason set the halter on Cedar's neck again for a single heartbeat, then returned it to the rail, letting leather remember that its first duty here was conversation, not custody or command. A gust nudged the shadecloth into a hushful wave, and the big shoulders barely rippled, proof that flutter had been reclassified from thunder cousin to curtain, friendly and uninterested in alarms. Whitaker sketched a trailer plan for next week that moved at the speed of kindness, promising rubber mats, dim light and early endings, because travel goes farther when anxiety is not paying the tolls. Mason asked that loading rehearsals start with doors open and feet planted, teaching that space can remain space without becoming trap, a grammar that nervous systems rarely get to conjugate. Caleb volunteered to practice hinges until they hummed courtesy instead of scraping nerves, promising oil, cloth and patience, three small mercies that turn hardware into furniture in frightened memories. Cedar lowered the head until the forelock brushed shadow, and the breath that followed sounded like a house unlocking quietly, not to flee, but to let fresh air visit rooms that used to hide. Mason spoke the name once more in a register made for bones, letting the syllable travel without escort, and the ears answered forward like open hands, a posture that spends no bravery on panic. He shaped a door of air toward pasture grass and cancelled it mid-gesture, rewarding only the thought because the scholarship here pays for curiosity, not distance, and never charges interest to exhaustion. Whitaker chuckled that the ranch felt larger now that fear had given back some acreage, and his laugh did not spook anything, which felt like proof that even joy can learn barn manners. The farrier's rasp shadow lay forgotten beside the rail, a quiet monument to tools that behaved, and Caleb stepped around it as if honoring a veteran who asked for no parade and needed none. Mason promised evening water and early lights, pledging that progress would be stored in small containers, because big jars break when carried by hands that raced too many miles too recently. A pair of swallows stitched blue thread between posts, and the horse watched the sewing without bracing, discovering that quick movement can embroider peace rather than slice it into ragged ribbons. The veteran set his palm near the muzzle and let an inch of friendly weather remain, and breath braided breath again, the simple communion that keeps tomorrow from spending courage before dawn. He ended the moment first, a gift wrapped in retreat, proving that departures which leave dignity intact return with interest, and that interest buys patience when crowds or ghosts come calling. Whitaker signed a final initial and offered supper in the tone of a neighbor, not a merchant, and Mason accepted, grateful that hunger today would be met by stew instead of adrenaline. Caleb coiled the lead line and held it like a sleeping river, astonished that tools can grow lighter when trust begins carrying the heavier share of gravity inside everybody's chest. Cedar exhaled a long elastic yawn and shook from pole to tail, loosening cobwebs of old alarms, then stood so still the shadecloth forgot to flutter, choosing boredom over legend without regret. Mason asked for the gate to open the width of a palm and promised nothing further, then closed it softly, letting the hinge rehearse kindness once more, because repetition is the mother of courage. The sun slid behind the windbreak and turned rails to warm silhouettes, and the paddock's silence felt earned, not empty. The difference between absence of noise and presence of peace. Whitaker pocketed the receipt as if filing away a ghost, and he nodded to the big student, with a respect usually saved for good rain, grateful that fate sometimes answers in plain weather. Mason touched the cheekpiece for 2 patient beats, withdrew before memory could object, and stored the small yes where nighttime would keep it warm, next to letters he reread when desserts got loud. They left the arena slow as librarians closing a beloved room, and behind them, hooves shifted once and then rested, the sound of a chapter ending without slamming the book on anybody's fingers. In the quiet kitchen, over stew and modest laughter, they planned a Sunday of gentle nothing, while the metal tag on Mason's palm cooled into ordinary, the kind of ordinary that rescues whole futures. Sunday arrived with a hush that felt deliberate, and Mason kept his promise to let ambition sleep, choosing chores that sounded like lullabies rather than drumbeats that might wake yesterday's nerves too quickly. Whitaker walked the fence line with a coffee that tasted of cedar smoke and relief, checking boards by touch instead of suspicion, as if his palms had decided to trust what numbers could never fully capture. Caleb filled troughs in unhurried arcs, letting water ribbon from bucket to basin, and each shimmer looked like punctuation that favors commas of rest over exclamation points that tire the heart before noon. Cedar grazed with cathedral composure near the windbreak, lifting the head only to listen, and what returned through those ears was ordinary weather, a miracle disguised as boredom arriving right on schedule. Mason stood nearby with pockets empty of tools and full of breath, practicing the discipline of not fixing what was not broken, which had once been the rarest skill in his old collection of habits. A neighbor idled by the far road and decided against stopping, sensing that interruptions here would cost more than they could afford because peace charges premium rates to those who treat it like entertainment. Whitaker suggested a short pasture walk at dusk, with nobody carrying expectations, and the idea settled on the rails like friendly dust, visible only when sunlight chose the right angle to greet it. Caleb stitched a simple path through knee-high grass with the rake's back, a ribbon wide enough for hooves and patience, teaching the ground to hold their rhythm without tripping courage into old reflexes. Mason spoke Cedar's name once with a tone shaped like shade, then said nothing else, trusting that repetition can be a kind of greed when the nervous system is still learning to believe in gentle futures. The horse answered by lowering the head until breath fogged the grass, and the inhale that followed felt like a house opening windows, not to flee, but to invite new air to explore its quiet rooms. Whitaker cleaned a curry comb with a rag that knew restraint, then set both on the fence where sight could practice neutrality, proving that tools become furniture when nobody uses them like verbs. Caleb practiced hinge courtesy on the empty gate, counting 4 soft beats to close and 4 to open, until the iron learned to hum agreement instead of scrape arguments across fragile attention. A cloud shouldered the sun and returned it gently, and in that softened light, the old scars looked less like verdicts and more like footnotes, a sign the main story had finally reclaimed its paragraph. Mason walked a slow half-moon near Cedar without inviting, without withdrawing, letting orbit replace approach, because companions sometimes protect peace best by refusing to colonize the same square of air. Whitaker rewound the week inside his chest and found the loudest moments had grown quiet, not because memory had weakened, but because courage had learned to file noise under history instead of prophecy. Caleb asked whether rest could be considered training, and the veteran nodded, explaining that muscles keep lessons only when fatigue does not steal the ink, a wisdom he wished someone had taught him sooner. Cedar twitched an ear toward a distant tractor, then returned the ear to grass, a small vote for staying present, and the paddock accepted the ballot without ceremony, which is how democracies of calm survive. Mason set the halter over the neck for one heartbeat and let it fall again. A rehearsal that respected tomorrow's appetite, because hunger for trust is healthiest when fed in careful, steady portions. Whitaker mentioned trailer mats and rubber edges and windows that would not glare, then stopped himself, realizing that planning is useful only until it starts flirting with the adrenaline it promised to avoid. Caleb sketched a chalk square by the gate and called it the Porch of Decisions, a place where requests would arrive wearing slippers, not boots, so choices could greet them without bracing for invasion. The breeze lifted shadecloth into a gentle wave, and no muscle panicked, which felt like proof that repetition had finally taught Flutter to speak the local language without shouting its consonants. Mason let 3 long rungs of breath rise and fall, and Cedar matched the ladder halfway. Enough to braid air without surrendering independence, a compromise both bodies recognized as honorable. Whitaker placed a bucket near the chalk porch and did not announce it, allowing usefulness to be discovered rather than imposed, the way good teachers let students feel clever for finding obvious doors. Caleb carried a folded towel and made it practice moving like a slow flag, then stopped before curiosity turned into suspicion, because endings that arrive early keep the future from becoming skittish. Mason spoke to Bones again, promising that Monday would taste like patience, not exams, and that any walking would end before pride grew hungry, a syllabus written for hearts that once learned under gunfire. Cedar shifted closer by the width of a modest idea, then paused to check the weather inside his ribs, and when only calm answered, the pause lengthened into comfort rather than hardening into alarm. Whitaker glanced skyward and saw ordinary blue doing its unremarkable job, and he felt wealth that could not be banked, quiet hours deposited directly into sleep, accruing where ledgers never think to look. Caleb whistled a tune so soft it almost apologized for existing, and the notes wandered away without consequence, a rehearsal in which music learned barn manners and decided to keep them. Mason ended the afternoon before sentimentality complicated it, closing the gate with library softness, then leaving by the slowest path, honoring the day's thesis that boredom, well-timed, can be holy. As evening folded itself around the windbreak, Cedar breathed a long elastic breath and stood easy, while 3 humans agreed without words that tomorrow could begin small and still count as a beginning. Dusk softened the paddock into velvet margins, and Mason rehearsed not moving at all, trusting stillness more than clever strategy to keep tomorrow's beginnings gentle, legible, and merciful to fragile memory. Whitaker walked the outer lane with his hat in hand, counting quiet instead of boards, discovering that wealth sometimes arrives as hours unbroken by alarms rather than as numbers stacked inside ledgers. Caleb knelt to smooth one ragged patch of dust by the chalk porch, explaining that tidy thresholds help choices feel welcome, the way swept doorways convince guests that kindness already lives here. Cedar grazed near the windbreak and lifted his head only when the breeze changed keys, then returned to grass, writing a small vote for the present tense and letting yesterday rest undisturbed. Mason practiced the name once in a register made for Bones, Cedar, and let the syllable drift away without claiming anything, so the word could remain shelter rather than becoming an impatient command. A neighbor's dog barked twice and then remembered manners, and the horse measured the ripples, decided they were shallow, and allowed his ribs to continue the quiet rowing that kept calm afloat. Whitaker asked if Monday should include a single step, with leather actually buckled, and Mason said perhaps provided the buckle meant conversation first, and that ending would arrive early, no matter success. Caleb suggested oiling the trailer hinges at sundown, not to hurry the future, but to prevent scrape music, because courage listens better when hardware hums courtesy instead of sharpening nerves into knives. The veteran set his palm near the muzzle and left a thumb of evening between skins, letting breath braid to breath, then stepped away first, protecting the bridge from Triumph's heavy boots. Fireflies stitched patient commas along the fence, and Cedar watched the punctuation without bracing, learning that flicker need not predict thunder, that light can edit darkness without demanding confetti. Mason remembered desert nights where breath meant survival, and he thanked this quieter theatre, promising that Monday's lesson would stop while still hungry, because appetite teaches better than exhaustion. Whitaker placed a bucket by the chalk porch and said nothing about it, letting usefulness discover itself, the kind of teaching that leaves dignity intact and gives memory fewer reasons to argue. Caleb drew a fingertip circle on the rail where Cedar had rested his nose, then wiped it away, choosing living warmth over relics, because souvenirs often steal room from tomorrow's living air. The shade cloth breathed a slow wave and fell still, and no tendon snapped an opinion, which felt like proof that repetition had finally negotiated a truce between movement and the old alarms. Mason described Monday's choreography for Bones again. 3 steps beneath shade, a pause for breath, 1 soft turn, and then an ending, the sort of modest plan that refuses to borrow thunder. Whitaker nodded with the relief of practical men who prefer quiet competence to spectacle, admitting that sleep had returned to his house because patience now kept the night patrol instead of fear. Caleb asked whether names ever change, and Mason answered that they deepen when treated kindly, the way wood smells richer after rain, and that Cedar would be allowed to grow meanings at his own pace. A tractor coughed far away, then settled into a polite idle, and Cedar remained anchored, hooves agreeing with gravity as if the ground itself had finally become a trustworthy partner in calm. The veteran laid the lead line across the rail where moonlight could rinse yesterday's worries, reminding himself that tools carry stories, and that tonight's story should end without cliffhangers or noise. Whitaker promised to keep visitors sparse through the week, saying that reputation could wait while healing earned its balance, because gossip spends progress faster than any ranch can afford to mint. Caleb practiced closing the gate in 4 quiet beats and opening in 4 until Hinges learned the hymn, a small liturgy that teaches metal to stop sharpening the air into careless arguments. Mason touched the cheekpiece for 2 unremarkable heartbeats and withdrew before memory could invent an objection, storing the yes where midnight would keep it warm without turning warmth into fire. Cedar shifted closer by the width of a modest idea, then exhaled a long ribbon of breath that smelled of hay and safe weather, and the evening carried it gently, not needing to translate. The wind pressed a cool palm over the pasture and found no panic to need, only muscles learning boredom's holy craft, and boredom agreed to stay if everyone promised not to chase applause. Mason spoke to Bones one last time, promising that tomorrow would measure success in endings rather than distances, and that any triumphs would travel home quietly in pockets, not riding on trumpets. Whitaker folded the day like clean canvas and said he would cook stew again because comfort continues lessons after rails go dark, and nourishment keeps promises from collapsing under their own sincerity. Caleb stacked tools where eyes could see peace instead of threats, arranging them like furniture rather than warnings, so Monday would greet familiar shapes without waking ghosts that love to rehearse. The veteran closed the gate with library softness and left the latch resting, not clenched, because even closures can speak kindly, and the hinge answered with a note that sounded like permission. Cedar lowered his head until starlight embroidered the forelock, then stood perfectly ordinary, a competence disguised as quiet, while 3 humans felt tomorrow's map settle into their breathing. They walked away slower than they arrived, letting silence write the final paragraph, and in the kitchen Mason placed the tag beside his cup, grateful that the future no longer shouted to be believed. Monday lifted a pale lid from the pasture, and Mason entered with pockets empty of urgency, carrying only breath and the promise that any victory would end before pride learned how to make speeches again. Whitaker walked the perimeter once, counting quiet instead of boards, and returned with the relaxed arithmetic of a man whose ledgers had finally learned to keep hours of peace as profitable entries. Caleb set the shade cloth into its slow hymn and checked the buffer lane, then placed water at the porch of decisions, letting usefulness arrive unannounced so nerves would not feel recruited into performance. Cedar stood beneath the soft light with ribs rowing steadily, listening to the grammar of ordinary morning, and nothing in that grammar suggested thunder, only commas inviting breath to finish their gentle clauses. Mason rested a hand-width of air near the muzzle and spoke the name once in a register made for Bones, then stepped back first, reminding the bridge that departures keep it strong enough for future crossings. He lifted the halter like a question rather than a verdict, draped the crown for a single heartbeat and let it fall, paying with disappearance so leather would continue meaning conversation instead of custody. Whitaker nodded at the modesty of the ritual and said nothing further, because commentary spends calm too quickly, and calm was the only currency accepted at this particular bank of nervous systems. Caleb matched the kneecap grammar 2 steps behind and quieted his shoulders until even the hinges learned manners, turning hardware into furniture that memories could walk past without raising shields. Mason asked for a thought of forward and cancelled it immediately upon arrival, teaching that success here travels best in unmarked wagons, far from the toll booths where pride collects noisy payments. Cedar shifted 1 respectful inch, then checked the weather inside old scars, finding no storm forming, and let the inch become 2. A geography lesson drawn in dust by hooves that now trusted their map. The veteran set the crown again and buckled leather softly, not to capture but to translate, whispering that words like stay could mean comfort rather than arrest when taught at the temperature of shade. Whitaker adjusted his hat and watched the ears flick, then settle, and he discovered that relief can be quiet enough to feel like competence, which is the flavor peace prefers when it wants to last. Caleb held the lead line slack so gravity could keep its dignity, and the slack spoke a new alphabet to muscle, one where letters curved like rivers and never sharpened into spears aimed at memory. Mason invited a first official step under shade, and when the ankle whispered yes, he erased pressure mid-beginning, rewarding intention rather than distance, so appetite for courage would remain delicious. Cedar completed the inch without borrowing panic, and air seemed to grow kinder inside the paddock, the way rooms feel larger when doors remain open and nobody mistakes the opening for a demand. He offered a second step and cancelled half of it, letting stillness arrive sooner than accomplishment, because ending early protects tomorrow from paying interest on today's greedy ambitions. Whitaker breathed into his hat brim a gratitude he did not say aloud, tasting how rest can repay debts left by years of adrenaline, the kind of balance no calculator ever learned to display. Caleb counted breaths like a metronome buried under quilts, barely audible and completely reliable, and the count braided to Cedar's ribs until numbers felt like lullabies instead of instructions. Mason asked Bones for a soft turn no wider than a patient smile, guiding shoulders with the idea of a door made of air, then vanished the door before memory could accuse it of becoming a trap. Cedar pivoted the width of a courteous thought and paused to listen, discovered only quiet waiting, and allowed the pause to ripen into comfort, a fruit sweeter than any applause could ever purchase. The veteran stepped away first and let the line drape into punctuation the body could read, a comma inviting breath rather than a period that slams endings closed with unnecessary courtroom ceremony. Whitaker checked the crowd that was not there and felt grateful for absence, realizing that learning sometimes needs witnesses made only of dust, sunlight, and a ledger willing to whisper. Caleb brought water low, and the muzzle visited with dignity, recording the sip under the chapter titled Ceremony, Not Reward, so memory could stop confusing kindness with bribes offered by fear. Mason buckled, unbuckled, and rebuckled without hurry, each action ending before suspicion woke, teaching leather that its job was to speak fluent safety rather than to collect rent from old alarms. Cedar breathed warm fog across the veteran's sleeve and kept the head low, a posture that felt like a house opening a window not to escape, but to let fresh air learn the floor plan of peace. He invited 3 steps as promised and cancelled the third again, protecting appetite for tomorrow by storing today's sugar in small jars, the only containers strong enough to travel intact. Whitaker murmured that hauling could wait a week if patience asked nicely, and patience did, so the plan bent toward mercy, which turned the calendar into a partner rather than a bully with sharp elbows. Caleb practiced the gate on 4 quiet beats, open and close until the hinge sang courtesy, and even the iron seemed relieved to retire from its old career as a maker of careless arguments. Mason touched the cheekpiece for 2 unremarkable heartbeats, then returned his hand to his pocket with reverence, storing the yes while it was warm, so the night would have something honest to keep. They ended before triumph arrived, dressed as efficiency, closing the session with library softness, and the paddock kept its breath steady, as if the ground itself had decided to memorize gentleness. Cedar felt the halter settle like weather rather than verdict, and the line draped slack, a sentence whose grammar favored commas of breath over iron periods that once slammed chapters closed. Mason asked for a second gentle step and cancelled the pressure mid-thought, rewarding intention before distance, storing the appetite for tomorrow in small jars where patience preserves sweetness. The horse completed 2 respectful inches and paused, checking the sky for old artillery that never came, while Whitaker counted quiet again and discovered profit hiding inside unbroken minutes. Caleb matched the pause with shoulders that forgot to shout, finding that help grows invisible when trust begins to work, and his silence turned into scaffolding strong enough to hold modest miracles. Mason rotated his hips to suggest a soft turn, no sharper than a friendly smile, then erased the request at the first whisper of try, proving that exits remain holy architecture in this arena. Cedar pivoted a fraction and kept the head low, breathing into the space between ribs and rope, teaching leather to translate companionship rather than to enforce laws written by yesterday's alarms. Whitaker adjusted the shade to favor gentler light, discovering that stewardship sometimes means tilting the sun, so the past stops squinting and the present can read the future without flinching. The veteran let gravity polish his heels into anchors, allowing the floor to loan him steadiness, and the loan cleared without interest because humility paid installments exactly on time. He unbuckled, rebuckled, and unbuckled again with ceremonial boredom, turning hardware into vocabulary and vocabulary into kindness, the only dialect nervous systems accept as legal tender. Cedar licked and chewed like a clerk filing paperwork, then released a yawn that stretched the morning, and the yawn hung in the shade like a banner announcing that peace had clocked in early. Mason invited a step toward the chalk porch and closed the invitation before movement finished, reminding memory that opportunity here does not trap, it simply visits and leaves the door open. The horse allowed the inch to become a thoughtful half-step, then paused to listen to the ground, and the ground answered with quiet that felt earned rather than borrowed from fragile luck. Caleb whispered the count that kept hinges polite, 4 to open and 4 to close, and the gate obeyed, singing a small hymn that made even iron feel welcome in a sanctuary built from patience. Whitaker repositioned a bucket where decisions feel safe, then kept his hands still, practicing the expensive art of not improving, which often protects progress better than busy good intentions. Mason touched the cheek piece for 2 slow heartbeats and retreated, paying with disappearance again because endings that arrive early teach futures to come back willingly rather than under protest. Cedar breathed warm fog against his sleeve and did not claim more space, a courtesy that turned restraint into partnership, as if both bodies had agreed to share ownership of the silence. The veteran shaped a door of air toward the pasture and cancelled it halfway, rewarding curiosity without billing it for courage, a billing error he planned to repeat until safety felt wealthy. Whitaker measured the distance to the trailer with eyes that preferred mercy, promising rubber mats and unhurried ramps next week, after boredom had grown roots deep enough to stop rumors. Caleb coiled the lead line like a sleeping river and let it rest on the rail, proving that tools can nap when trust is awake, and that naps are lessons when nobody insists on performance. Mason asked for 3 official steps under shade and stopped at 2 and a sigh, letting success remain slightly hungry, because hunger for calm is the only appetite he truly trusts to guide training. Cedar pivoted the width of a polite idea and settled, and the settling felt like rain deciding to be soil, not flood, a decision that saved everyone the cleanup once required by storms. The veteran praised with bones rather than voice, lowering his eyelids and spine, performing gratitude so quietly that even old ghosts lacked excuses to rise and demand louder ceremonies. Whitaker checked the absent crowd again and smiled, relieved that reputations were growing from sleep rather than spectacle, a harvest accountants rarely understand, but families learn to spend wisely. Caleb placed the towel where breezes could practice without startling anyone, and the cloth behaved like a friendly flag, a citizen of calm waving from a country newly independent of fear. Mason buckled leather once more and walked a half-step, then returned the distance as a gift, reminding both bodies that ownership of motion stays shared, the deed written in breath and patience. Cedar followed the retreat with a volunteer inch that nobody celebrated out loud, and the quiet around that inch felt like a contract notarized by dust, sunlight, and 3 steady human hearts. The veteran ended the lesson before triumph could dress itself as efficiency, closing the gate with library softness and promising that tomorrow's map would draw only slightly larger circles. Whitaker wrote the day's ledger line as hours of peace rather than dollars, and the numbers made more sense than any bid, because sleep now paid dividends that receipts never managed to declare. Caleb gathered tools into visible comfort rather than threat, arranging the world like a home that expects kindness for supper, not arguments, and the paddock inhaled as if agreeing to stay civilized. Mason rested his palm near Cedar's muzzle one last time, left a thumb of weather between skins, then stepped away first, grateful that progress had learned to breathe without needing applause to live. By Monday's quiet dusk, the word Cedar had woven itself through bone and breath, turning a monster's rumor into a living promise that walked at the speed of kindness beside a battle-tired man. Mason understood that healing is not a verdict, but a daily choosing, and he chose again, lowering pride, raising patience, and letting faith occupy the space where fear once parked its engines. Whitaker measured profit in boards unbroken, and hours of sleep returned, discovering that mercy has interest rates kinder than any bank, and he paid forward the silence that made this arithmetic possible. Caleb learned a new craft that schools rarely name, the slow grammar of presence, where elbows speak gentleness and exits stay unlocked, so trust believes it can safely visit again tomorrow. Cedar, who had been judged unbuyable, now carried a name that smelled of shade and timber, and the name carried him back, stitching weary histories to futures that promised purpose without spectacle. The ranch itself seemed to practice Sabbath in motion, trading sirens for steady breath, as though the land remembered prayer better when spoken by hooves rather than by hurried human sentences. Mason knew deserts had trained his body to guard life with quiet, and he offered that quiet like water, proving that faith is a choreography of small rescues, not a theater of sudden miracles. When the halter rested like weather rather than law, leather translated companionship, and Cedar answered with ordinary courage, the kind whose footsteps are soft enough to avoid waking old ghosts. They planned trailer lessons written in mercy, open doors, dim light, early endings, because journeys that begin as invitations rarely need force later, and purpose grows straighter when it germinates in peace. The crowd had gone, yet its better lesson stayed, that boredom is sometimes the face of safety, and that true strength is a shelter others can enter without surrendering dignity or voice. Where rumor once shouted ferocity, the quiet now spoke responsibility, and Mason accepted stewardship as a vow, promising to spend patience like bread so no one's hunger had to prove anything again. Whitaker, surprised by his own hope, found himself blessing the ordinary, discovering that redemption often looks like paperwork and hay and sleep, not trumpets, headlines, or applause from strangers. Caleb folded the rope like a sleeping river and smiled at its lightness, realizing that tools weigh less when trust agrees to carry the heavy half of gravity inside everyone's chest. Cedar breathed into Mason's sleeve and found no demand hiding there, only shelter. And the shelter answered back, reminding them both that love is a practice of returns, not a seizure of control. They did not call it victory, because victory invites pride to make speeches and pride wakes panic. They called it faith in motion, a modest covenant to keep ending early so tomorrow arrives calm. In that covenant lived superation, not as fireworks, but as steady discipline. The daily refusal to feed old monsters, the daily choosing of patience until purpose walks home without needing an escort. Their hope became practical, a trailer mat here, a shaded lane there, because purpose matures when logistics serve compassion, and compassion matures when people prefer rest to the harvest of spectacle. At the gate, Mason whispered gratitude to absent brothers and to the God who hears quiet promises, trusting that mercy finishes what kindness begins and writes destinies no ledger can fully total. And when evening gathered them like faithful arms, Cedar stood ordinary and unafraid, a living proof that names can be bridges, and that bridges are built by breath, not by the noise of triumph. Before you go, let this story walk beside you in one small act. Subscribe to the channel. Tell us where you're watching from and share what you felt while listening.